United States has this kind of wonderful population of extremely well-educated AI gurus that are working day and night on breakthrough technologies. We're fortunate to have with us one of those very gurus here at the moment. Richard is at Salesforce, which deals in enterprise software, a fantastic, dynamic company, and is their chief scientist. I wonder if we could just start by asking you a little about how you ended up at Salesforce, because you were originally on the path to be a PhD, and then you were teaching, and you were thinking you were going to become a professor, but how did it happen that you ended up at Salesforce?
Yeah, hello everybody. I'm very excited to be here today. I graduated from Stanford in 2014 in computer science, worked to bring deep learning technology into natural language processing, and then almost became a professor, but decided to do a startup. It's called MetaMind. We basically try to make AI accessible for everybody, so that even without a multi-billion-dollar research budget, you could very easily train computer vision and text classifiers, understand natural language, understand visual inputs. And we were around for not too long, about a little less than 2 years, and then Salesforce acquired us, and that's how I became chief scientist there.
Acquired you in the process, huh?
That's right.
So chief scientist, what does a chief scientist do?
It's a good question. It's actually an interesting role that I think more and more companies probably want to start thinking about if they don't already have one. In my case, I lead and started a pure research group that actually tries to advance the state of the art in AI research, deep learning, natural language processing, reinforcement learning, computer vision, recommendation engines, speech recognition, a whole host of different areas that we focus on the research side. But then I also think about how to get AI into all our different products. And in some cases create new products, and in some cases just make the products more efficient and have new kinds of AI-powered capabilities.
And how big is your team? What's the group that works on this?
So we don't generally disclose exactly how large each teams are, partly because it changes, and it also depends on how you define people working on AI. Right. You have pure researchers who actually just try to publish papers, and then you have data scientists, and you have a lot of those. You have engineers who need to actually run everything and create data, make sure your data is secure and trusted and can't be easily hacked and all of that. So depending on how far you go and who touches AI, it actually changes orders of magnitude sometimes, the definition of how many people work in AI.
So anyone who has been to a Salesforce office or dealt with Salesforce or even kind of seen some of their advertisements will know that they often have these cartoons of bears and people camping and, forest
animals. And the cute little Einstein character.
And then there's this Einstein character, which pops up now in all the marketing campaigns. One of the products you created is Einstein Vision. What is that?
So Einstein is our term for all the AI that as it applies to the CRM, so customer relationship management systems, mostly focusing on sales, service, and marketing. And there are a bunch of different Einstein groups. It's a pretty complex system. We have made a lot of acquisitions in this space, including my own startup, and are continuing to make acquisitions in the data space in general. And so Einstein is kind of AI for CRM.
Huh. So what does it enable you to do that you wouldn't have been able to do otherwise?
Great question. So we actually have a bunch of different applications on the computer vision side, where, for instance, in marketing, you can now go through all social media pictures and find your company logo and identify which scenes your company logo is shown so that you understand how consumers interact with your brand. This is something that there wasn't really a job that AI took away there, because no single team could go through all social media images and try to find your company logo. Right? So it's actually a new kind of job that was created by understanding how to use that kind of technology for your marketing campaign, reach out to people. You can now feed that directly into service. So for instance, you take a picture of a shoe and say, that piece of crap fell apart. Now, you don't say hashtag the shoe company, but you can actually see the company logo in that picture. So now from having a potentially bad marketing message, you can now trigger a service case, and you start having somebody reach out from the service department to the folks that posted a tweet or another social media message, and then actually help them, basically make an unhappy customer into a happy one. So that is an application that started with computer vision, which is essentially one of the big AI application areas. Now, in natural language processing, we have a whole host of new things. One of the things we just announced that also came out of the research group is Einstein Voice Assistant, where you can walk out of a meeting and basically dictate notes like, oh, I just met the VP of sales of Acme Corporation. We should do a follow-up with their VP of engineering in 2 weeks and maybe upgrade this opportunity to $100,000 of total revenue or something like that. And now you just say that after you walk out of the meeting, and instead of having to go into a screen and go through a bunch of different different menus and drop-down menus and so on back on your desk, you basically just had this short dictation, and now it will do all the speech recognition, the natural language processing, and then connect it to the database about your customer and update your customer field. So it's, again, a new application powered by AI. And maybe one of the most exciting areas, I think, for AI is in service, where we are the largest, by far, service organization. Most of the largest call centers in the world run on Salesforce software. And we see AI and natural language processing have a huge impact there. We already can deflect a very large percentage of incoming chat requests. So if you have a little chatbot that comes up on a website, and somebody asks a question about their order or something like that, you can basically automatically respond to the majority of those incoming chat requests with the power of AI.
Wow. So we were talking a little bit with Kai-Fu Lee about this very thing. And does this have worrisome implications for many emerging economies that have sort of built their growth around call centers and these kind of services? What's your thought about what kind of effect this technology has on jobs?
So I think the AI impact on jobs in general is pretty complex. Just with the case of Salesforce, right? In sales, if you make your salespeople 50% more efficient, you're not going to say, oh, let's fire 50% of the salespeople to go back to our original lower level of sales. You're just happy that you're selling more. In service, it might be a different story where it's a cost center. And if you can automate 50% of your service requests, you might say, all right, well, we can make the whole service operation more efficient, and we don't need as many people answering calls because an AI answers some of the simpler calls. You can also, as a CEO, now think about what that means for your service organization, for your employees, and start helping them, retrain them in cross and upselling opportunities after an AI made a successful, gave a successful answer quickly. You can have a person come in and say, hey, now that we have great service, maybe you also want to buy some of our other products. So, which is actually a scenario we've seen CEOs think about. Not all of them, but some of them do. And then in marketing, I think AI will create new kinds of jobs where once you understand, oh, wow, I can go through billions of images and find my brand and then maybe create specialized marketing messages for different groups of people. Using AI can create new kinds of jobs for the people who understand how to use it. Now, I think every industry you have to look into the potential for automation. I think agriculture, for instance, has a huge potential of automation. Highway truck driving, especially when combined with 5G, where you can maybe have people log in, has a huge potential for automation. Radiology and medicine, I think, is phenomenal. And to be honest, in medicine is a good example of an industry where personally, I care more about more healthy people rather than more jobs in medicine, right? You want to, if you can automate certain scan analyses of radiologic scans, you can find more efficient drugs and medications with AI and so on. That's great. I don't want to create more jobs in medicine. I want to create more healthy people more cheaply and quickly. But in general, it's a complex question. You really need to look into each industry and to understand the effect.
Fascinating. My father is a radiologist, so he thinks he got out, just retired, just in time. I wonder if we could talk maybe a little bit about how widespread these technologies are. I was reading a McKinsey study the other day that said, yes, it's true that a lot of these technologies are advancing very rapidly, but in fact, implementation still has a long way to go. And they said, the big impact from these technologies is just if you took the existing technologies and implemented them to their full potential, that could be enormous. What do you see at Salesforce in terms of how widespread the actual implementation of some of the things that you've already developed is in the American or even the global business landscape?
I think the sort of almost trope that the future is already here, it's just not equally distributed, is also true for artificial intelligence. You have some organizations with multi-billion-dollar research budgets, like Google, that say, we're an AI-first company, and every single aspect of their company is changing with AI. It's also slightly easier for Google because they have certain parts that are required for AI already in their DNA, and that is rapid iteration and A/B testing. For instance, understanding, is this version of a search better than this version? That's something they started doing basically on their first year of their existence. Now, what I often observe is companies come to us and to me and they say, oh, we want to use AI. And I'm like, okay, where's your data? And they're like, well, one is in some local database over here, and we have some Word documents in these folders. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not going to cut it. So what you actually realize is when you want to get AI, you need to first have like proper digitalization, make sure you don't have paper processes still. There's still a lot of supermarkets, for instance, who go manually and have paper sheets of like this many produces, like types of produce went bad this week. So of course, then you can't have AI predict how much, how many different products you need to buy and how to update them. So you need to go through that digitalization process. And then you need to basically make sure all your data is in the right place, is cleaned. So there's a lot of complexity around data cleaning. And then in many AI applications, you need some kind of supervision. And generally, AI has sort of two lines. One way of dividing AI is unsupervised and supervised. And the majority of powerful applications that we've seen are supervised, where we have some input X and some output Y. And you need a lot of training examples of certain inputs with certain outputs. And those inputs can be all kinds of different things. It can be like a lettuce leaf in a field, and should you pick it now? Should it get water? Or should you just pass? Right? That can be an input with the outputs I just mentioned. The input can be a radiology image, and like how many microfractures do you see in that bone? It can be a blood sample. How many red and white blood cells do you see? It can also be an incoming email, and the answer is how many, or what is the answer to that incoming service request that you got in an email. Now, if so far you've just had Gmail and Outlook and somebody kind of answered those emails for you, then you're not going to be able to use that data to then train an AI system. So in this case of email answering for service requests, you want to have, for instance, a CRM where you keep track of like this incoming email was answered by this person, this was the knowledge base article that finally resolved that problem, and here are the action items that you need to do to follow up. If you keep track of all of that as your standard business process, then you can use the data much more quickly and actually create an AI capability. So thinking about the data is basically the first step for a lot of companies to actually make use of AI.
It sounds like you need to really kind of work on developing a kind of a just data infrastructure that enables you to actually use the AI technology. Now, that seems to play and sync up very well with something that kind of Lee mentioned, which is that we may be shifting from an age of discovery to just an age of simple, maybe not simple, but at least grinded out implementation. Do you share that view, or do you still think that big breakthroughs are going to be where the advances are?
I do think the current AI technology is already in a place where it can basically have a positive impact on pretty much every industry out there.
Right.
And if you're an industry leader, you're a company leader, you need to think about how AI impacts your industry. At the same time, I still think there are a lot of exciting advances that are happening. Like machine translation has only recently gotten so good that you can now automatically translate documentation, for instance, with very little to no human input. Chatbots are still an exciting area. There are some sort of general chatbot startups, both in China and the US, where you can just have any conversation with your chatbot friend, right?
Yeah.
Those can still be improved further to really be like your best friend with a perfect memory of all your issues and your boyfriends or girlfriends that you've had and all of that, that's such that they really remember everything accurately. So in natural language processing, we can still have a lot more breakthroughs that will then start to have new kinds of capabilities. For instance, reaching out as a salesperson and really trying to convince somebody to buy something, NLP isn't there yet. But it will be, as we continue doing research in the next couple of decades. And so, we can't write novels. There's still a lot of interesting parts of the human condition and human endeavors that AI cannot do. And I think research will slowly work itself towards that. But again, I think AI is already here to be ready to change pretty much every industry.
So I'm curious to hear more about what you think about that. I mean, we heard Kai-Fu say that the jobs of the future, the ones that are going to be safe from AI and robots, are going to be ones that involve empathy, creativity. But is it possible to create AI that displays at least some proxy of empathy, or that could be creative? I mean, we've seen in the last year or so trying to use AI to generate paintings. You probably saw this piece in the New York Times the other day, to get AI to generate videos, kind of movies, to write music. Many different people are experimenting with ways to make AI more human-like and creative. What do you see as the potential for those kind of activities?
So I think in general, you have to acknowledge that AI is only as good as the training data that it gets. That being said, not everybody is that good at reading other people's emotions. You know, you work in very technologically deep fields. You will meet people who aren't that good at reading micro expressions or facial expressions and things like that. And so there are some simple ways you can fake having empathy. Of course, you know, the actual underlying condition will take a lot longer.
I see. There was a really fascinating story, I want to say about a month ago, maybe a month and a half ago, that involved Amazon and trying to use AI for their HR and recruiting process. And they had, you know, they hire so many workers, and they had figured out that that's very time consuming, and that they often didn't get good results from the people that they hired. And so they wanted to create an AI that would help them to identify people that had traits of being a good worker, and they spent years and years working on this, and they thought it was going to overcome problems of gender bias and other types of bias. And what happened?
In general, when you apply AI to important decisions that really touch human lives, you really want to very carefully think about how it impacts people and what the training data really, what kind of patterns the training data had. And so if you make hiring decisions based on AI, and you've had potentially racist or sexist hiring managers somewhere in your company, then their bias will be, you know, part of the data set, which will then get picked up by an AI algorithm. And so I could have kind of predicted that that will not work. We had an internal team that wanted to do some human emotion classification. And I asked them, what's your training data? And they're like, well, we got these stock images, you know, from stock companies. And I already knew that it's not going to work. It's like there will be very few examples of like very old people being super happy. And so it'll probably just say every old person is grumpy, and people of certain races are more angry or less happy, and so on. And so I think basically we shut down that project for now, because you need to really think about all the different classes of people and communities and minorities that are, you know, going to be impacted by your data, and you need to make sure you have the right kind of training data that won't have as much bias. And then sometimes it's hard to get the bias out of your training data, and you need to think about algorithmic ways to make sure at least the bias doesn't get amplified, and even then it might not be good enough. And you need to really rethink whether you should employ certain AI features at all. There are some startups that claim they can predict whether somebody's gay, and it's terrible research. There are papers that just show that they think they did it on some training data set, but then you just put on different kind of classes and boom, you're like gay. So it's ridiculous. So there are a bunch of hypey kinds of issues in AI where people are a little overeager, and both on the positive side thinking, oh, we can have these applications, but also on the negative side thinking, oh, we'll take over all the jobs, or we'll, you know, become self-conscious and try to take over humanity and things like that. And that is basically where we need to differentiate between excitement, which is reasonable, and hype, which is unreasonable.
Do we have questions from the audience? I know we've got our mic wranglers over here if you do. Let me ask you about one of the implications of your answer just now, which is that all these different forms of AI and how they're implemented raise ethical questions that have to be grappled with. Salesforce has a very interesting policy when it comes to applying ethics to AI and technology. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we just So we already had a chief ethics officer, but it was more of a legal kind of requirement, like making sure you don't accidentally bribe people, or make sure you're in within the law and all the different jurisdictions that we operate in, which is a lot. But now we actually think about the overall use of technology, not just to meet the bare minimum legal standard, but actually think about positive impact on the world, and also trying to reduce negative impact. So not working with organizations that try to propagate hatred or try to be racist and hurt minorities and organizations like that. So we're in the process of starting an Office of Ethical and Humane Use. And I'm pretty excited about that, also a little bit involved with that. We already have a Chief Equality Officer too, who's phenomenal. And so I think it's something that we as a company care about a lot. And AI, it's kind of interesting. AI ethics very quickly becomes general ethics, and that quickly becomes politics, and that quickly becomes culture. So you need to be really careful how you draw those boundaries and where it makes sense for you to think about, okay, this is an AI ethics issue, and this is just where we have a stance that we feel like will apply to all different stakeholders that we have, versus, okay, here we just amplify our own biases too. So yeah, it's something that's really important for us. And in AI, it becomes especially important because we're a platform company, and we don't have access to our customers' data. We're basically holding it, we're storing it for them. But unlike consumer companies where it's all free, so you're basically the product to be sold and your data is, we don't have access, we don't look at the data. So we allow people to create their own AI algorithms, and we don't see exactly what they're trying to predict. So we need to educate them, and that's why I'm excited to have Trailhead as part of our AI efforts. It's essentially a learning platform, and for certain features, like Prediction Builder, where you can predict one column from any other set of columns, which is basically 80% of what enterprise AI needs to do. Like the column could be, will somebody pay back their loan? Should we give a student loan to this student, or should we give a housing mortgage to somebody, and things like that. So there's some pretty important kinds of columns that are in CRM. And you can basically add a race column to it and then create a racist loan classifier. And so to help companies avoid doing that, we have a Trailhead that talks about exactly the kinds of bias issues that we talked about before.
So these are things that are a combination of both applying human empathy and sensitivity, and then also using algorithms to flag behaviors that might not be ethical.
That's right.
So at least that's a certain category of jobs that are being created by advances in AI. We've got 1 minute. I wondered if you could say a little bit about your thoughts about China. You mentioned the many different jurisdictions that you operate in. One of them that you don't operate in is here. Do you have plans to come here soon?
So we have a hub model for Asia. We have 2 big hubs in Singapore and in Hong Kong. And we have a lot of international customers who have a lot of customers, of course, in China, and we're supporting them through our hubs.
I see. As you look at the landscape in China, is this a landscape that you think is conducive to innovation in AI, or is it one that poses obstacles and restrictions?
Absolutely. I think it's very exciting to see how China is forging ahead in AI. I think they have a unique perspective also, and it's clear that the government has realized how important that is for the whole economy. And now I think after China, months or in some cases years after China has done it, a lot of other countries have also talked about how they will support AI in terms of both research and industrial applications.
Well, we'll leave it there. Richard, Socher, thank you so much. We'll hope that you'll come back to China often and help us stay on top of what's happening.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.